The river glistened under the burning sun, its waters carrying the scent of dust and sorrow. The plains were silent, except for the hooves of the horses and the muffled cries of a young woman being dragged toward the water's edge. Her dress was torn, her hair tangled with dirt. Her eyes wide with disbelief searched the horizon for mercy that refused to come. The men who held her wore the dust of the frontier on their coats and the cruelty of power in their eyes. They said she had sinned, that she had crossed a line no woman should ever cross in a land ruled by fear and lawless hearts. But in truth, they were men who hid behind righteousness to mask their own sins. The town had whispered for weeks about her. Some called her cursed. Others claimed she had brought shame to decent folk by harboring secrets that didn't belong to her kind. But none of them knew the truth of what happened in the canyons, nor how she came to meet an Apache warrior, whose eyes carried both the fire of vengeance and the calm of a man who had seen too much death. It began when she tried to save a wounded rider from the desert. She didn't know he was Apache, not until she saw the beads around his neck and the markings on his arm. By then, it was too late to turn back. She had tended his wounds, brought him water, and protected him when the posse came searching. And now, that single act of compassion had turned her into a target. The men dragged her deeper into the river, the water rising past her knees. One of them, a sheriff's deputy, muttered that it was the only way to cleanse her soul. The other said drowning was mercy compared to what she deserved. They didn't see the ripples forming farther out, or the shadow that moved beneath the current. The river was calm, but something ancient stirred within it. Something that belonged to a time before fences and rifles. Before men came to claim land that wasn't theirs, the young woman's breath came in short bursts as they forced her forward. The water was cold and heavy. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her mind replayed the moment she had met the warrior. He had spoken few words, but his gaze told her everything. He was a man bound by silence, by duty to a people nearly erased by the greed of settlers. And yet, in his silence, she had found peace. She had felt safer beside him than she ever had among her own. Now, as the men cursed her and tightened their grip, she wondered if he had escaped or if he too had been hunted down and buried beneath the sand. A hawk screeched above them, circling the sky as though warning of something unseen. One of the men looked up and spat. "Bad omen," he said. "Means the spirits ain't happy." The leader, a broad man with a gray beard and eyes like cold steel, didn't flinch. "The only spirit I answer to is the law," he said, though even his voice trembled when thunder rolled across the distant hills. He raised his hand to signal the others, and the woman was forced down onto her knees in the river. The water lapped against her chest as she gasped, her hands trembling, her fingers clutching at air. Somewhere beneath that surface, the current shifted. The deputy's horse neighed and backed away, its eyes wild. The leader barked orders, but the air had changed. The stillness was wrong, like the world had paused to watch. A ripple cut across the river, then another, stronger this time. The men hesitated, their boots sinking into the mud. The woman lifted her head, her wet hair clinging to her face, and whispered a single word, a name that only the wind could hear. She remembered the night before, when the Apache warrior had spoken of the river spirits. He said that water remembered those who had fallen unjustly, that when a soul was wronged, the river carried its pain. "If ever you find yourself alone by the water," he had told her, "listen, the river knows my voice." Now, as the men raised their hands to push her under, the river answered. It began as a low hum beneath the surface, like a song carried by the current. The water darkened, and a sudden wave broke against the men, throwing them off balance. One cursed and fell to his knees, his hat floating away. The others gripped the woman tighter, thinking she was trying to escape. But her eyes were not on them anymore. They were on the water ahead, a head in the shadow rising from it. A figure emerged. Tall and silent, his skin glistening with water and sunlight. His hair clung to his shoulders, and in his hand he held a spear carved from bone and wrapped with leather. The Apache warrior had returned, his face calm yet burning with fury. The men froze, unsure whether to draw their guns or run. The warrior's eyes met the woman's, and for a moment, everything else faded: the river, the shouts, the fear. Only that look remained, a promise made in silence. One of the men shouted, "It's him, the savage," and reached for his pistol, but before his hand touched the handle, the warrior raised his spear. The river seemed to move with him, swirling around his legs as though alive. The deputy stumbled backward, slipping in the mud. The woman screamed for them to stop, her voice breaking through the chaos. But the moment was already breaking apart like glass in a storm. The warrior stepped closer, his movements slow but deliberate. His gaze locked on the man who had been leading the mob. The leader's voice wavered as he barked an order. But the others didn't move. They could feel it tooth the weight of something older than them, something that didn't belong to their world of laws and guns. The warrior lifted his spear higher, the sunlight flashing off the blade. The woman tried to rise, her hand shaking as she struggled against the current. The river rushed harder now, swirling around them all, pulling at their feet, whispering with a sound that was almost human. Then came the silence. It was the kind of silence that only happens when fate is holding its breath. The warrior's chest rose and fell. His eyes locked on the men who had brought death to his people. The same kind of men now standing before him with fear in their eyes. The woman looked from one face to another, her lips trembling. Somewhere deep inside her, she knew this was the moment everything would change. The line between mercy and vengeance, between love and survival, hung as thin as the blade of that spear. A gust of wind tore through the valley, bending the tall grass along the riverbank. The hawk above gave one final cry and vanished into the clouds. The warrior took another step forward, and the men instinctively raised their weapons. But before anyone could fire, the river surged upward, throwing a wall of water between them. The woman's scream was lost in the roar as the current swallowed everything in sight. When the spray settled, all that remained was the sound of rushing water and the shadow of the warrior. Standing tall against the storm, the woman's head broke through the surface, gasping for air, searching for his face. She saw him through the mist, his hand reaching out. His voice carried by the wind and words she couldn't understand but felt deep in her soul. Then the light shifted, and he was gone, swallowed by the water that had birthed him. The men who had dragged her were nowhere to be seen. Their shouts lost to the river's song. The sun slipped behind the clouds, casting the world in a pale, ghostly light. The woman crawled to the shore, her hands trembling as she looked back at the water that had both saved and taken everything. In the stillness, she heard the faint echo of drums from somewhere beyond the hills, a rhythm that pulsed like a heartbeat, ancient and unbroken. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer, not knowing if it was for the warrior, for herself, or for the land that seemed to remember every sin ever committed upon it. And as the last rays of sunlight touched the water, a ripple broke across the surface, once more soft, deliberate, as if reminding her that the story was not over yet. The river had quieted by dawn, leaving only a faint mist drifting across its surface. The woman sat on the damp bank, her dress heavy with water and her body trembling from the cold. The wind brushed her hair across her face, and her eyes, red and swollen, stared blankly at the place where he had vanished. The Apache warrior's image still burned in her mind. It's that look in his eyes that carried both fury and something else she couldn't name. She tried to tell herself it had been real, that he had truly risen from the water and saved her.
Ow.
But doubt crept in like the morning chill. Maybe it had all been a dream brought on by fear and exhaustion. But when she looked at the broken branches and the men's scattered belongings floating downstream, she knew the truth. Something had happened here that no one would ever believe. The sun began to rise, painting the plains in shades of gold and red. She pulled herself to her feet, every muscle aching. Her home lay miles away, but she couldn't return there now. The people who had condemned her would not rest until she was gone for good. They would claim she was possessed, or that she had made a deal with the devil himself. She looked back at the river one last time before turning toward the trees, her bare feet sinking into the soft earth. The wind carried faint echoes of drums again, far away but rhythmic, steady like a call. She followed it, unsure if she was chasing life or walking straight into death. By midday, she had reached the edge of the canyon, a place where few dared to go. The rocks were sharp and the air carried the scent of sage and smoke. She remembered what the warrior had told her once, that his people used to live beyond these cliffs before the soldiers came. that they buried their dead in caves above the river, where the spirits could still hear the wind. She sat beneath a twisted tree, her mind drifting back to the first day she met him. It had been 3 weeks earlier, on a blistering afternoon when the desert shimmered like glass. She was riding alone, carrying supplies to an abandoned ranch, when she saw him lying near a dry creek bed. His horse had been shot, and his body was half covered with dust. She thought he was dead until she saw his fingers twitch. Fear told her to ride away, but something stronger held her there. He was young, strong, but bleeding badly. A musket ball had torn through his side. She had seen wounds like that before during the raids. Most men didn't survive, but she couldn't leave him. She dismounted and knelt beside him, pouring the last of her water onto his cracked lips. His eyes had opened slowly, sharp and dark, watching her with the wariness of a wounded animal. For 2 days she hid him in an old barn, bringing him food and tending to his wounds. He never spoke much, but when he did, his voice was calm and low, like the steady rhythm of the earth. He told her that he had been hunted by men from her town, accused of stealing horses and killing a rancher. But he swore he had done neither. He had only come to find his brother, who had been taken by soldiers. She didn't know if she believed him at first, but when she looked into his eyes, she saw truth, or at least pain too deep to fake. As his strength returned, he began to help her with small chores. Fixing the fence, fetching water, moving quietly through the woods like he belonged to them. The nights were the hardest. Sometimes she would wake to find him sitting by the fire, staring into the flames with a look that chilled her more than the cold air. He carried memories heavier than his silence. Once, he told her that he had lost his entire family in a raid when he was a boy, and that the river was the only place he ever found peace. The water forgets nothing, he said, but it forgives everything. Those words had stayed with her long after he disappeared into the night, leaving behind only his carved bone pendant hanging from a nail in the barn. She had kept it close to her ever since, not knowing why. Now, as she sat beneath the canyon's edge, she took the pendant from her pocket and turned it over in her hand. It was smooth from years of wear, etched with markings she didn't understand. When she held it up to the light, the shape of a hawk was carved into its surface, the same hawk that had flown above the river yesterday. Her breath caught. Maybe he hadn't left her at all. Maybe he had been watching, waiting for the moment she needed him most. The sound of hooves broke the stillness. She froze, pressing herself against the rock wall. Voices echoed down the trailmen's voices. She recognized one of them immediately, the deputy who had held her arms at the river. Her heart began to race. He was alive. That meant the others might be too. She can't have gone far, he was saying. That which belongs at the bottom of the river? She clutched the pendant tighter and stayed silent. The men rode past, their rifles slung across their backs, eyes scanning the canyon floor. When their voices faded, she slipped deeper into the rocks, careful not to make a sound. The sun was sinking by the time she reached a hidden path that wound down toward the lower gorge. The trail was narrow, lined with jagged stones and dry brush. She stumbled more than once, her legs shaking from exhaustion, but the faint sound of water below pushed her forward. She reached the base of the canyon just as the first stars appeared. The river was there, calm again, glimmering beneath the moonlight. She fell to her knees beside it, too tired to cry. The night air was heavy with the scent of rain and smoke. Then she saw a faint glow near the opposite bank. A fire. She crept closer, staying low behind the rocks. A single figure sat by the flames, his back turned to her. Her heart thudded so loud she feared it would give her away. When he turned, the firelight revealed the same strong features she had seen through the water. The Apache warrior. He was alive. His eyes found hers almost immediately, as if he had known she would come. He rose slowly, not reaching for his weapon. She wanted to speak, but the words caught in her throat. He motioned for her to approach, and though her body trembled, she stepped forward. He studied her for a long moment before speaking. "The river spared you," he said quietly. "It does not do that for many." She could barely breathe. "They wanted to kill me," she whispered, "because of you." He looked toward the flames, the muscles in his jaw tightening. "They wanted to kill me too. But the river chose otherwise. She didn't understand what he meant, but there was a strange calm in his voice, a certainty that made her feel both afraid and safe at once. She told him about the men searching for her, about the whispers in town, about how they called her cursed. He listened in silence, his expression unreadable. Finally, he said, "You helped one of my people when no one else would. That is why the river protected you. But now you cannot go back. They will not forget." His words struck her like cold steel. "Then where do I go?" she asked. He looked into the darkness beyond the canyon. "There are places where their laws do not reach. But you must choose freedom with danger or safety in chains." The fire crackled between them, throwing shadows across their faces. She felt the weight of his gaze and the pull of something deeper than fear. She didn't know what fate awaited her if she stayed with him, but she knew she couldn't face the world that had tried to drown her. The sound of distant thunder rolled across the valley, echoing off the cliffs. The warrior turned his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. "They will come again," he said. "And next time, the river may not be enough." The night deepened around them, and the flames flickered low. The woman felt a strange peace settle over her, though danger still lurked beyond the shadows. Somewhere in the distance, wolves began to howl. The warrior stood and looked toward the dark hills. "Tomorrow," he said, "we move before dawn." She nodded, clutching the pendant in her hand. As the fire dimmed, she felt the rhythm of the drums again, faint, steady, and calling her toward a destiny she didn't yet understand. The fire burned low as dawn began to pale the sky. The woman sat near the dying embers, her knees drawn close, staring at the smoke curling upward. The Apache warrior stood a few steps away, scanning the horizon where shadows moved like ghosts. Neither spoke for a long time. The quiet between them was heavy but not empty. It was the silence of two souls carrying too much pain to name. When he finally turned toward her, the first light touched his face, showing the lines carved by struggle and loss. "They will track us," he said in a low voice. "Men like them never stop when they think they've been shamed." She nodded, though her heart felt tired. She had been hunted before, but never like this. Never with a man the whole territory wanted dead beside her. She asked him what he planned to do. He looked toward the east, where the river wound like a silver snake through the plains. "There is a place beyond those ridges," he said. "My people once gathered there. The land remembers us, even if the world does not." He bent to stir the ashes, his movements steady and quiet. "If we reach it, you'll be safe. The spirits there do not welcome those who come with hate in their hearts." They began to walk as the sun climbed higher, their path rough and narrow, cutting through stretches of dry grass and low shrubs. The woman stumbled often, but he never spoke of her weakness. Instead, he would pause, waiting for her to gather her breath before moving again. They didn't talk much, but she could feel a strange bond forming between them, bond born not from choice, but from survival. Each step away from the town felt like a step away from the person she used to be. By midday, stopped near a grove where the trees grew thick and the air smelled of wild herbs. The warrior knelt beside a small stream, cupping water in his hands. "The earth still gives to those who take only what they need," he said quietly. She watched him, noticing the way he seemed to belong to the land, the way he moved without disturbing a leaf, how he listened before speaking, how his eyes caught every motion in the distance. In his presence, she felt both small and protected. Though she didn't understand why, he told her fragments of his story as they rested. His tribe had once lived across the valley, before soldiers forced them into barren lands farther south. His family had resisted trying to return home, but a raid had wiped out their camp. He had survived only because he was hunting that day. When he returned, he found ashes where his world used to be. "I buried what was left," he said, his voice quiet. "Since then, I have carried the weight of what they took." She didn't know how to comfort him, so she simply listened. As the day stretched on, the woman began to remember pieces of her own story too. Her husband had died 2 winters ago, shot by raiders who stole their cattle. She had tried to hold on to their ranch alone, but the men in town treated her like an intruder in her own home. They called her stubborn, unfeminine, cursed. When the crops failed, the whispers grew louder. Helping the wounded Apache had been her final mistake in their eyes. They saw kindness as betrayal and mercy as guilt. The trail curved toward the foothills where rocks jutted out like teeth. The wind carried distant sounds, hoofbeats, faint but unmistakable. The warrior stopped, his hand on his weapon. "They're close," he murmured. They took cover behind a ridge, watching dust rise on the horizon. A small posse was following, their silhouettes moving against the sun. She recognized one of them, the deputy. Her stomach tightened. "He won't stop," she whispered. The warrior nodded, his expression unreadable. "Then he'll meet the river again." As the riders drew nearer, the warrior motioned for her to follow him up a hidden path leading higher into the rocks. They climbed in silence, the sound of hooves echoing below. From the ridge, they watched the men search the valley. The leader dismounted, examining the ground. "Tracks," he said, his voice drifting upward. They went north. The deputy spat into the dirt. "Then north we go. The witch and the savage both hang when we find them." The words stung her more than she wanted to admit. She had once believed in justice, but now she saw how easily men used it to hide cruelty. When the posse moved on, the warrior turned to her. "They'll keep following the river. We move west," she hesitated, looking toward the distant plains. "That leads into the Badlands." He met her eyes. "That's why they won't follow." They traveled through the night, their path lit by the moon. Coyotes cried in the distance, and the wind whispered through the grass. She asked him how he always seemed to know where to go. He told her that his people had walked this land for centuries. "The stars are maps," he said, pointing to the sky. "The wind tells direction. The river gives warning." His words carried a quiet reverence that made her realize how differently he saw the world. To her, the land had always been harsh and lonely. To him, it was alive, filled with voices and memory. By the second day, her strength began to fade. Hunger gnawed at her, and the heat burned her skin. When they finally reached a narrow canyon with a small spring, she collapsed beside it. The warrior gathered wild berries and roots, offering them to her. "Eat," he said. She smiled faintly. "You sound like my husband used to." For the first time, he looked surprised. "You were married?" She nodded slowly. "He was a good man. I buried him on our land." After that, the world turned cold. The warrior's eyes softened. "The world has a way of testing the living," he said, "but it also gives second chances." That night, as they sat by another fire, he began to carve a small piece of wood, his hand steady. She watched quietly until curiosity won. "What are you making?" He looked up, his dark eyes meeting hers. "Something to remember this path by," he said. "When the wind changes, it will carry our scent. The spirits will know where to find us again." His words both comforted and frightened her. She didn't understand his beliefs, but she respected them. There was something pure in his way of honoring the world around him. Something she felt her own people had lost long ago. In the distance, thunder rolled again. The air grew heavy, thick with the promise of rain. She lay awake listening to the drops hitting the rocks, thinking about the town she left behind. She wondered if anyone there felt guilt for what they had done, or if they had already spun a new story to justify their cruelty. She thought about the deputy, the leader, the men who had dragged her to the river. Their faces haunted her. What kind of world punished kindness? What kind of people found power in another's pain? The warrior's voice broke through her thoughts. "You still look back," he said from the other side of the fire. "The past is like the river. It pulls you if you stare too long." She turned toward him, her eyes glistening in the firelight. "And what if the river never lets go?" He looked into the flames. "Then you learn to swim against it." Before dawn, they were on the move again, climbing higher into the hills. The storm had passed, leaving the earth damp and fresh. But danger lingered. From a distant ridge, a faint glint caught the warrior's eye metal, flashing in the sunlight. He stopped abruptly and motioned for her to stay low. The posse was closer than he thought. The woman felt fear rise in her chest as she heard the faint echo of voices drifting on the wind. The chase wasn't over, not yet. They hid among the rocks as the sound of hooves grew louder. She could see them now, the deputy in front, his rifle resting across his saddle, eyes scanning the trail ahead. The warrior's hand gripped his weapon, his body tense but still. The woman's heart pounded as she looked at him, realizing that whatever lay ahead, their lives were now bound together. The storm had washed away their tracks, but fate had not washed away their pursuers. The wind rose again, carrying the low rumble of distant drums from beyond the hills. The warrior turned his head toward the sound, his expression shifting. "The spirits are restless," he murmured. "Something waits for us beyond this ridge." She wanted to ask what he meant, but before she could, the first gunshot cracked through the air, echoing through the canyon. The world exploded into chaos. The river of fate began to move again. The first gunshot shattered the morning calm, echoing off the canyon walls like a thunderclap. Birds scattered from the cliffs, and the woman dropped to the ground as the sound rolled through the air. The warrior's hand shot out, pulling her behind a large boulder as dust rained from above. The second shot followed, closer this time, hitting the rock near her shoulder. She felt the sting of stone chips across her cheek. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst. The posse had found them. The warrior's face was calm, but his eyes burned with fierce focus. He peered around the edge of the rock, his jaw tightening. The riders were spread out below, moving slowly through the canyon, their rifles drawn, using the boulders as cover. The deputy was in front, shouting orders, his voice full of confidence and anger. "They can't run forever," he yelled. "The savage won't save her this time." His words made her tremble, not from fear, but from the reminder of what they had done to her. The warrior motioned for her to move quietly up the slope. "Go," he whispered. "Stay close to the rocks. I'll draw them away." She shook her head, clutching his arm. "You'll be killed." His gaze softened for a moment. "The river didn't save me to die here." Before she could stop him, he slipped away into the shadows, moving like part of the earth itself. She pressed her back against the stone and began climbing. The path was steep and uneven, and her hands were raw from gripping the sharp edges. But she didn't stop. The sound of gunfire rang again, followed by shouts. The posse had seen movement. When she reached a narrow ledge, she looked down and saw him, a dark figure darting between rocks, swift and silent. The deputy's men fired again, but he was too fast. He disappeared behind a cluster of trees, and moments later, a horse screamed as it reared up. The men cursed, firing wildly. One fell from his saddle, clutching his shoulder. The others scattered, yelling his name. The woman used the chaos to climb higher, but the ledge crumbled under her foot. She slipped, barely catching herself on a jagged rock. Blood ran down her palm, but she forced herself to keep going. Below, she could see the warrior using the land to his advantage, moving unseen, vanishing into the dust and reappearing only to strike. But she knew there were too many of them. For every man that fell, another closed in. Thunder began to rumble again in the distance. Dark clouds rolled over the hills. The storm that had passed the night before had returned, angrier and heavier. The wind howled through the canyon, bending the trees and swirling dust around her. The sky darkened, and flashes of lightning lit the cliffs in quick bursts of white. She reached the top of the ridge and fell to her knees, gasping for breath. The air smelled of rain and gunpowder. From above, she saw the battle below, the posse still chasing shadows through the rocks, and the warrior standing near the river's edge, his body poised like a mountain against the wind. The deputy was shouting, trying to rally his men, but his voice was lost in the roar of the storm. The warrior stood unmoving as the first drops of rain began to fall, his long hair whipping across his face. Something about the way he faced them alone, unshaken, filled her with both pride and dread. The rain came down harder, turning the ground slick and the rocks treacherous. Lightning struck nearby, shaking the canyon with its force. The warrior moved again, swift as the wind, using the storm as his cover. The deputy fired, the sound echoing, but the shot went wide. The warrior closed the distance between them, grabbing the deputy's arm and twisting it hard enough to send the gun flying into the river. The men around them hesitated, unsure whether to fire. The rain was blinding, and thunder drowned their voices. The woman started down the ridge, slipping on the wet rocks. She shouted his name, her voice carried by the storm, but he couldn't hear her. She saw him strike the deputy's rifle away, saw the flash of a knife drawn in panic. The deputy lunged, and the two men fell into the mud, locked in a struggle. The river churned beside them, rising fast with the sudden downpour. One of the riders spotted her and fired. The bullet struck the stone near her feet, spraying mud across her legs. She stumbled, sliding down the slope until she hit the ground hard. Pain shot through her arm, but she forced herself up. Another rider charged toward her on horseback, his face twisted with rage. She scrambled for cover, finding a fallen branch heavy enough to use as a weapon. As the rider swung down to grab her, she struck with all her strength, hitting his leg. He yelled, lost balance, and fell into the mud. The warrior saw it happen. He turned from the deputy just as another man raised his rifle toward her. With a burst of speed, he threw his spear, striking the rifle aside. The weapon fired into the air, the bullet lost in the rain. The man fell backward into the river, the current dragging him away. The warrior's eyes found her through the storm. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. Then another shout cut through the noise. The deputy had risen again, blood running down his face. He grabbed a rock and swung it, striking the warrior across the shoulder. The warrior staggered, his hand going to the wound, but his eyes never left the man before him. The woman ran toward them, slipping and sliding through the mud, calling his name. The deputy lifted the rock again, screaming words she couldn't hear. Before he could strike, lightning split the sky above them, followed by a deafening crack. The blast threw them both to the ground. The air smelled of burning earth, and for a moment, everything went white. When the noise faded, she found herself crawling through the mud toward the riverbank. The deputy lay unconscious a few feet away, the earth around him smoking. The warrior was on his knees, drenched in rain, breathing hard. His eyes met hers as she reached him. She wanted to speak, to tell him not to fight anymore. But before she could, another shot rang out from the ridge above. A rider who had stayed back was aiming directly at them. The warrior pushed her aside just as the bullet hit the ground near his hand. He rose and charged forward, unarmed now but fearless. The rider tried to reload, his hands trembling in the rain. The warrior tackled him before he could fire again, and the two crashed into the mud. The gun slid away, landing near the woman. She ran for it, her heart pounding. She picked it up, the cold metal heavy in her hands. Her fingers shook as she pointed it, unsure if she could pull the trigger. The warrior looked back at her, his expression calm, as if telling her she didn't need to. The rider beneath him struggled, reaching for his knife. She froze. Then thunder roared again, and the river surged higher, its water foaming and wild. The warrior and the rider rolled closer to the edge, fighting for balance. She screamed for him to stop, but her voice was lost in the storm. The earth beneath them gave way, and both men fell into the raging current. She ran to the edge, her heart tearing apart as she saw the river swallow them. The current was too strong, carrying logs and debris from upstream. She called his name again and again, her voice breaking with every cry. Then, through the lightning flashes, she saw him, his hand gripping a branch, his body fighting against the current. He was alive. She stumbled down the slope trying to reach the bank, but the ground was slick and unstable. The rain poured harder, and the air grew darker. The river roared like a living beast, its waves rising higher with every heartbeat. She slipped, landing hard on her knees, mud clinging to her dress. She could barely see him now, his figure fading into the chaos of water and storm. But she refused to give up. She crawled forward, shouting his name again, louder this time. Her voice cutting through the storm like a cry from the soul. He turned toward her, struggling to stay above the water. Their eyes met once more through the rain. Then, with one last burst of strength, he pushed himself toward the shore. The current fought to pull him back, but he kept moving. She reached out her hand, screaming for him to take it as the storm raged around them. The moment hanging between life and death, love and loss, hope and despair, balanced on the edge of fate. Waiting to break, the river crashed around them, wild and merciless, as if determined to test every ounce of their strength. The The woman reached out, her arm trembling, her hand inches away from his. The warrior's fingers brushed hers once, then again, until finally their hands locked tight. With a cry that was half fear, half hope, she pulled with everything she had. Mud slipped under her feet, but she refused to let go. The current fought to tear them apart, but he kicked against it, pushing toward her, until at last, with one final heave, he came crashing onto the bank beside her. They collapsed together in the rain, gasping for air, the storm howling above them. For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the river's rage fading slowly into the distance. She looked at him, his face streaked with blood and rain, his chest rising and falling. He turned his head toward her, managing a faint, tired smile. "You pulled me from the water," he said, his voice rough. She shook her head, tears mixing with the rain. "You saved me first. I wasn't going to let you go." The storm began to break, the dark clouds parting to reveal a pale morning sky. Sunlight spilled over the canyon, touching the land with warmth again. It felt like the earth itself was breathing after holding its breath for too long. Downriver, the wreckage of the fight was carried away. The men who had hunted them were gone, some lost to the storm, others scattered and broken by their own hatred. The deputy's hat floated by, spinning slowly on the surface before sinking into the depths. The river, once wild, began to calm again. The woman watched it in silence, knowing it would keep their secrets. She turned back to the warrior. He was leaning against a rock, his shoulder bleeding, but his eyes were clear. She tore a strip from her dress and pressed it to the wound. "Hold still," she whispered. He winced, but didn't move. "You should have left me," he said quietly. She shook her head. "I couldn't. You were the only one who ever saw me as human." His gaze softened. "And you were the only one who saw me as more than an enemy." They stayed by the river until the rain stopped completely. When the sky cleared, it was painted in soft gold and blue. Birds returned, perching on branches still dripping with water. The land felt renewed, cleansed of blood and anger. They gathered what little they had left and began walking. The warrior led the way, his pace slow but steady. She followed close behind, her heart lighter than it had been in months. Every step away from the river felt like a step toward life again. By evening, they reached a wide plain where the grass moved like waves in the wind. The sun was setting behind the distant hills, painting the world in amber light. The warrior stopped and turned to her. "We are far from the town now. They won't follow us here." She nodded, though she couldn't help glancing back one last time. Somewhere beyond those hills lay the life she'd lost, her home, her memories, the people who'd turned against her. But none of it called to her anymore. The world ahead was quiet, untouched, full of promise. They made camp near a cluster of cottonwood trees. He started a small fire while she fetched water from a nearby stream. The flames danced in the gentle wind, casting long shadows across the grass. She sat close to the warmth, feeling the ache in her arms and legs fade slowly. He handed her a piece of roasted rabbit, his expression calm but thoughtful. "When I was a boy," he said, "my father told me that every soul has two rivers. One carries the pain we cannot change. The other carries the life we can still build. You can't live in both." She looked at the fire, his words settling deep inside her. "Then maybe this is where my second river begins." He smiled faintly. "And maybe this time, it flows with peace." They ate in silence, the stars coming out one by one above them. The wind carried the scent of wildflowers from somewhere unseen. For the first time in years, she felt safe. She thought of the future, not the one the town had planned for her, but the one she could make for herself. A life without fear, where kindness wasn't punished, where every sunrise meant another chance. Days passed and the land began to heal around them. They traveled west together, following the old trails that the warrior's people once walked. He showed her places where the earth still held their stories, painted rocks, sacred springs, and hidden valleys filled with wild horses. Each place carried a memory, and with every step she learned more about his world. The more she listened, the more she understood that strength wasn't in anger but in endurance. He had lost everything, and still found a reason to live. She began to see the same strength in herself. They found an abandoned cabin near the edge of the valley, its roof half collapsed but its walls still standing. With time and patience, they repaired it together. She fixed the shutters and planted seeds near the door while he rebuilt the roof and mended the fence. The work was hard, but it filled the days with purpose. At night, they sat outside under the stars, speaking little, letting the wind tell the stories they didn't have to say aloud. One morning, she woke to the sound of laughter, the first she had heard from him. He was standing by the fence, watching a group of deer drink from the stream nearby. When he saw her, he smiled, the kind of smile that came from peace rather than pride. "The land remembers kindness," he said. "It gives it back when you least expect." She joined him by the fence, her heart warm. "Maybe people can too," she said softly. He looked at her, his eyes reflecting the morning light. "If they choose to listen." The seasons began to turn. The grass grew tall, and wildflowers painted the fields. The cabin became a home not grand, but alive with warmth and hope. Travelers sometimes passed through, strangers who asked for water or shelter. The woman greeted them without fear, offering kindness freely. Word spread through nearby settlements about a small homestead by the river where an Apache warrior and a woman lived together in peace, helping anyone who came their way. Some whispered that they were ghosts guarding sacred ground. Others said they were proof that forgiveness could still exist in a world divided by hate and time. The woman returned to the river where it had all begun. The water was calm and bright beneath the afternoon sun. She knelt by the bank, her reflection rippling gently on the surface. The warrior stood behind her, silent but close. She touched the water with her hand, smiling faintly. "It feels different now," she said. "Like it's alive again." He nodded. "It remembers what we gave it: pain, blood, fear. But it also remembers what we took back." She looked at him, her eyes soft. "What did we take back?" He placed his hand over hers. "Our freedom." For a while, they stood there in silence, listening to the gentle song of the current. The wind rustled through the grass, carrying the scent of summer and life renewed. The river flowed on, no longer a place of death, but of rebirth. As the sun began to set, they walked back toward the cabin hand in hand. The light turned the sky into fire, and the land seemed to glow with it. Behind them, the river shimmered, a living reminder of everything they had survived. The woman glanced at the horizon, her heart steady. She knew that the past could never be erased, but it could be forgiven. She had found not just a protector, but a partner, a man who carried both strength and peace within him. Together, they had rewritten the story the world tried to end that night. As the stars filled the sky, the woman lay beside the fire, listening to the soft breathing of the man who had once risen from the water to save her. She smiled, knowing that whatever trials had brought them here had been worth it. The land was quiet, the world finally at rest. Somewhere beyond the hills, the river continued its endless song, carrying their story through the heart of the frontier of courage, redemption, and the kind of love that outlasted even the fiercest storm. And for the first time in her life, she felt truly home.